Next week, the federal government will deliver a fall economic statement, sometimes seen as a mini budget that can contain new programs and new spending. It's that last part that has some on edge as the inflation fight continues. Goldie Hyder is president and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Goldie, great to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
So let's start there. What are you hoping not to see in the government's update next week?
More spending. I mean, look, I wish we were in that era where these fall economic statements had no spending at all, and we were just waiting for the budget to actually have the announcement. But we've gotten into an era where it's been freewheeling, and it's got to stop. It's got to stop because even Canadians have figured it out. I just saw a survey that said 2 out of 3 Canadians say they're not pleased with how the federal government is handling public spending, and I'm pretty sure they don't mean spend more. There is quite a bit of concern about the cost of borrowing, and if it's going to continue to increase for Canadians, for the government, it means it's going to hurt Canadians. And so we've got to send a signal that we understand the situation we find ourselves in.
The temptation, of course, will be to offer things that help with affordability. Sometimes some of that help can be seen as inflationary. Our central bank working hard to get inflation down. Would it be counterproductive for the federal government to offer supports to Canadians who are struggling with the cost of living?
Well, I think they are doing that. I think there's a number of measures the government has taken. I think they should be implementing those measures, as efficiently and as quickly as possible. And you've already heard from the central bank governor, as you mentioned, that this is how governments can hurt their agenda. And whether it's federal or provincial, spending more is inflationary. What we've got to do is bring that economic situation and reconcile it so that we can actually focus on some growth, Amanda. I wish these budgets had a little bit more implementation measures. There's so much that business is waiting for. Good policies that the government's announced in response to the IRA, but there's not even a website to figure out how to go get access to some of that capital. Meanwhile, where I am right here in the United States, money's literally being thrown out of helicopters for businesses to come and start up here.
And so on that front, I mean, obviously businesses are worried about a recession. They're still worried about their costs. They're worried about, in some cases, supply chain still and labor. What is the most important things that the government can do right now to make business better?
Well, they've got to create a more economically competitive environment for investment. And one of the things I hear, in fact, the thing I hear from those who make those decisions is, sure, it's one thing to have incentive programs, but you know what we really want is a sound fiscal framework, a government that understands that you've got to have some kind of a path to zero balance. You've got to be able to show that your debt to GDP ratio, which is what they're using, has a more reasonable measure today when we're suggesting, as David Dodge has, that the cost of borrowing should be proportionate to the revenues at a rate of 10%. The government's already spending more than that, and this is before you're going to start seeing the impact of rising interest rates on the borrowing costs for the federal government. So you got to have your fiscal house in order, Amanda. That's foundational, and the government should know that.
One of the things that a lot of borrowers, mortgage holders are waking up to, Goldie, is that even if rates come back down, they're not likely to go back down to the very low levels we enjoyed for a long time. Do you think the federal government has wrapped its head around that? Because its debt is also now just reset at a more expensive level.
Well, it better, because again, if the United States of America can get not 1, but 2 downgrades to some extent, Canada is as vulnerable as anybody else, and we can't afford that. Canadians know that if a downgrade ultimately means rising borrowing costs, and borrowing costs means cuts to transfers to provinces for healthcare, for education, for infrastructure. We've seen this movie, and we know what happens. So what we've been saying is avoid this by showing fiscal discipline, but also putting in place a plan for growth. Like, where is growth going to come from? And that means you got to work with your business community to figure that out so that Canadians can be assured that they'll have jobs today, tomorrow, and long into the future.
Goldie, so good to have you for this. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Goldie Hyder is president and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Time for the takeaway and why consistency matters. The federal carbon tax is under pressure, not just the regular pressure of the millions of Canadians who hate the tax, but thanks to a recent carve-out from home heating oil in the Atlantic provinces, it's under pressure for all kinds of other carve-outs. A poll this week showed 72% of those surveyed thought other forms of home heating fuels should also be exempt, in a nod to the rising cost of living. But this is the slippery slope the federal government could have avoided by refusing to exempt anyone from the levy. A carbon tax is designed to shift behavior. By putting a price on the pollution of what we consume, it lets users see how a different choice could cost less. Or it lets us pay for the burden of doing exactly the same thing we've always done. But either way, a tax like this only works if it's consistent. Anyone who's trained a puppy knows the truth of this. And yes, one of us is a dog in this scenario. You can reward a pup for doing the right thing 9 times out of 10. But if on the 10th you let him get away with not doing it, your good work is undone. All that's recalled is the exception to the rules. Taxation should also be consistent because it creates predictability for consumers and business and for anyone thinking about investing in Canada. Knowing the rules that apply is an important part of making the decision. If all you know is that the rules can change at any time, you will be reluctant to put your money down. Even Canadians who don't believe in a carbon tax don't think much about sudden exemptions for some but not others. The poll also showed that support for the Liberals, if anything, dropped after the exemption in the East. My takeaway? Leadership sometimes means sticking to your principles even when they're unpopular and being persuasive about why they matter. But that requires knowing in the first place. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.